Hi, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about Othello uh, along the same lines as I did with um, King Lear, Macbeth, and Hamlet. So to view the play Othello through the lens of ego and soul, and will add nature to this one. So I wanted to talk about interpretation. So in a lot of spiritual works and the classics, you could interpret these works on three levels, and I'm sure many others. But the three main ones would be the ethical level. So this is how characters treat one another, how characters behave uh, towards each other. Another level would be the psychological. So this is the internal man. These are the thoughts, the feelings, the motivations of the characters. And then the last interpretation would be the spiritual. What does the piece of literature say about the soul, about spirit, about God? So we'll look at again. So we'll look at Othello through the spiritual lens. So I guess the reason I'm saying this is many interpretations uh, can be true at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be this and that. First, I want to talk about the opposites that I see in Othello, and of course, there are opposites in every Shakespearean play. And I think that's because the opposites are the qualities or the inherent character of nature. And we'll talk more about that going forward here. So, kind of the antitheticals, the opposites in Othello. So, first, we'll start with the setting. So, we start in Venice, and Venice is a city is the city of Venus, and Venus is the goddess of love. Okay, so it's the feminine quality, it's the quality of love. And Cyprus is in Othello is a land of war. So again, from a spiritual interpretation, we're going from a state of love to a state of war, a state of spirit to a state of nature. So other opposites in Othello, you have light versus dark, and this is seen in the colors white and black. You have true and false. You have honesty and lying. You have limits and excess. You have pleasure and pain or suffering. And you have happiness and sorrow. So, again, these are qualities of nature, both spirit and nature. So allegorically, Othello can be seen as an interaction between soul, ego, and nature, and an interaction uh, among the three, between the three. So I'm going to focus on the three major characters: Othello, Iago, and Desdemona. Emilia and Cassio I will mention, but I won't focus on those two characters. So what is who is Othello, or what is Othello in the play Othello? So I think Othello is the soul, and I'll mention some passages uh, within the play Othello why I think that. So towards the beginning of the play, Othello says, "I would not my unhoused free condition put into circumscription and confine." Essentially, he's talking to another character. I would not marry Desdemona if I did not love her. Right? I would not limit myself if I did not truly love Desdemona. But again, unhoused free condition. The soul is in a state of freedom. It is not circumscribed or confined by uh, human thought or human feelings or human impulses. Another line, I therefore beg it not to please. So Othello is talking about why he wants to bring Desdemona to Cyprus with him. He's asking this of or saying this to the Senate. I therefore beg it not to please the palate of my appetite, nor to comply with heat the young affects in me defunct. Again, not to satisfy my or to gratify my own personal desires, but to be free and bounteous to her mind. So again, we have uh, giving, we have freedom, limitlessness. Later on, when he's talking with Iago, he says, my perfect soul will manifest me rightly. So basically, in the context of the play, he's talking about what I have done for the state will protect me against any criticisms or backlash I get from marrying Desdemona. Another phrase. So this is what Iago says of Othello. His is of a free and open nature. So again, we have the state of freedom, and we have open instead of closed and confined. We have open, spacious. When Othello is describing how he wooed Desdemona, he uses the word pilgrimage. In many spiritual works, they define the soul in nature as a pilgrimage. The soul's home is spirit, and nature is a pilgrimage. The soul is going through nature as a pilgrim. So these are just a few of the lines that lead me to believe that Shakespeare meant Othello to be seen as the soul in the beginning of the play. Well, in the play, period. Iago. So Iago is ego. So of course the similarity in the names. And when we first meet Iago, he's talking about hate. So he's talking about how he hates Othello. So there we're already, the conflict of soul and ego is being set up already. So and again, only the ego hates, the soul only loves. In the beginning too, Iago is describing about how he feels he deserves a position or title, in this case the lieutenancy, to be a lieutenant, when Cassio himself has been given it by Othello. So again, like we mentioned with Macbeth, the ego wants title, the ego wants position, the ego wants power, and for these to serve their own purposes, their own selves. And Iago says to Rodrigo when he's talking about servants, he says, and I think the intelligent servants, he says, they keep yet their hearts attending on themselves. So no matter what they do, it's in their own self-interest to do that particular action. Again, a quality of ego. Like I mentioned, I believe it was in King Lear, with Edmund comparing himself to Edgar. Iago compares himself to Cassio. Iago feels he deserves the position, that he's much better. He would be much better in the position. And he says of Cassio later in the play, Cassio hath a daily beauty in his life that makes me ugly. So again, all of us kind of in our ego say we always either do or have compared ourselves to others in some way, shape, or form. Iago exalts the rational mind. He talks about the rational mind, the thinking function a lot throughout the play. So the rational mind needs to kind of chop things up, break things apart in order to understand it. It needs to diversify things, compare things in order to understand it. So whereas the soul can intuit it immediately, it can know something immediately because of its intuitive nature. So when he's talking about Cassio and why Cassio doesn't deserve the position, why he does, he says Cassio has not set a division in the field. And again, this can be an allusion to the rational mind and to Iago and the ego itself. It has not divided nature. The ego, from the point of view of soul, also debases everything. So for Iago, love does not exist. It is an illusion. He calls it really lust and a permission of the will. So and willpower. So he also talks about willpower. And we'll talk about too, he equates the human body to a garden, and we'll talk about that later. But I think the reason Shakespeare has Iago, the ego, talking about willpower, is because it is the ego that has to make the decision to either become more spiritual or more bestial or more demonic. So that choice does reside with ego. So those are some of the reasons why I think Shakespeare equates Iago with ego. Okay, so Desdemona, what is or who is Desdemona, or what is Desdemona allegorically? I think she is nature. So nature, the inherent characteristic of nature is division. In nature, whether it's inside ourselves or outside ourselves, in order to give form, shape, so that we can see things, there's always opposing forces, or there's always two forces. So nature also can be nature outside what we see, and also internal nature, the qualities within ourselves. When she is characterizing what she did, as far as when she left Barbantio, her father, and married Othello in secret, she describes that as my downright violence and storm of fortunes. So again, down, again, descent, and violence, meaning a clashing, again, like war, a clashing of opposites, and the storm of fortunes. So only the ego can experience fortune. And fortune, again, is either the positives or negatives of success and failure, and also the positive and negative qualities within ourselves. Towards the end of the play, Othello describes Desdemona as thou cunningest pattern of excelling nature. So he uses the adjective cunning, meaning deceptive. So again, from the soul's perspective, nature is false. But again, pattern is, again, an inherent characteristic of nature. So whether that's shape, or whether that's repeatable processes or circumstances that happen over and over again. Okay, so the interplay between the three, between soul, ego, and nature, between Othello, Iago, and Desdemona. First, I do want to talk about the Sagittary. So in the beginning of the play, Othello requests that the Senate send for Desdemona and bring her to the Sagittary, so that she can explain how and why she fell in love with Othello. So the Sagittary can be an allusion to Sagittarius. And Sagittarius, not only a constellation in the sky, but Sagittarius was also worshipped as a god. And what makes up the body of Sagittarius? The upper half is human, and the lower half is a horse or a steed. So here we have in one image the soul, the ego, and nature. And I think the reason it's a horse, like we mentioned with Macbeth, is the horses indicate impulse, indicates movement, indicates action. That we are in our ego nature subject to these things. We're subject to impulses. We're subject to act. Okay, so that's Sagittarius. So how do Othello and Iago, how does soul and ego interact? So in the play, Iago says, if I were the Moor, I would not be Iago. So that could mean if I were soul, I would not be ego. Othello says again, I mentioned already, my perfect soul will manifest me rightly. Iago replies, by Janus, the god Janus, the two-faced god, I think no. So, and I'll talk about Janus and how that relates. But Iago also says, I think no. So I think, again, the rational mind, and no. No is always, and I think something that's inherent in ego is kind of negation. Things are not possible. Oh, I can't do that. That seems to be a more natural inclination to ego, where with soul, it's more about expansiveness. It's more about, yes, that can be done. Yes, that can be accomplished. So Janus. So again, Iago mentions Janus. So Janus is the two-face. It's the guy that has two faces and facing opposite directions. So that is, of course, not only a great image for the character of Iago, but for ego. The ego is very much susceptible to duality. And the ego identifies itself with the human body, and the human body has two hemispheres for the brain, two eyes, two nostrils. The tongue is bifurcated, and you have two hands, two ears. So the ego experiences everything through the human body. So that's why Janus would be a perfect image for ego. Janus was also the god of time. So Janus, or Janus, the god of time. So it's the ego and nature that are subject to time. Things are born, they grow, they die. The word cause is also mentioned in Othello, as it is in many of other Shakespeare's plays. And this may relate to causality, cause and effect, a law of nature, that everything that is done, there is a reaction to, right? Janus is also the god of boundaries, thresholds, doorways. So I think this points to the fluidity of ego, soul, nature, all interacting with one another. On the way to Cyprus, it is Othello who puts Iago in charge of Desdemona. So here could be an image of the soul putting the ego in charge of its interaction, or in the care of, or nature being in the care of ego. There's some relationship going on between ego and nature. Iago says, my jealousy shapes faults that are not. And he says this about himself, and he says this prior to Othello becoming jealous. And so that would indicate that Othello takes on the nature of ego later on in the play. when Othello and Iago are conspiring to kill Cassio, Iago says, "I am your own forever." So essentially, those two have become one in that moment. When Othello is in a rage and he wants to kill Desdemona, he says, and he says this in two separate instances, "I will chop her to messes. I will tear her to pieces." Again, this would be images of the rational mind, the thinking mind, to break up, to cut up nature. So, and it does appear over time that Othello becomes less of an instinctual. He doesn't trust his instincts like he did in the beginning of the play. In the beginning of the play, he says something to the effect that if I knew there was a cue to fight, I would know it immediately. Later on, after he's interacting with Iago more and more, he loses that. He begins to doubt. And again, this is also a quality of ego, doubt. That's also the quality of when someone is not acting within their own nature. Well, especially soul nature, which has an instinctual, intuitive quality to it. In the beginning, Othello cares about the state, cares about serving the state, doing what's right for Venice, and he also cares very much about the needs of Desdemona. Over time, again through Iago's manipulation, he, of course, becomes violent towards Desdemona, and he becomes consumed by his own ego. He becomes less eloquent. So, in the beginning of the play, in the middle of the play, he is very eloquent. Many Shakespeare scholars have commented on Othello's poetry. So he loses that over time. When he becomes angry, he can't complete sentences. It's very blunt and truncated, very choppy. The word slave and slavery is mentioned throughout Othello. Iago is called a slave. Othello, I believe, is called a slave, or mentions being enslaved in the beginning of the play. So again, this is the soul being enslaved to the ego, and this is the ego being enslaved to nature, through impulse, through the human mind, through impulses, through desires. So Iago and Desdemona. Shakespeare is trying to connect the two, that there is some sort of relationship between Iago and Desdemona, between ego and nature. So Iago talks about nature a lot. He talks about conception, pregnancy, birth. He uses these metaphors a lot. One of them is, "Helen night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light." Basically, how can he destroy Cassio, Othello, and Desdemona? And again, we have the opposites here. We have hell and night, birth, nature, and then to the world's light. And again, we have the world's light. So again, the earth. In the beginning of the play, he says the phrase "for certs," meaning for certain. But that could also, certs, if you take the T out, you have the goddess Ceres. And she is the goddess of harvest, and she's the goddess of growing, preserving, and preparing crops. So again, we have nature here. Like I mentioned previously, when Iago talked about willpower, he used the metaphor of the garden, right? That our bodies are gardens, and that really we can choose what we plant and what we harvest. So essentially, what qualities we can feed, and what qualities we don't feed. So we can either become more spiritual, or more human, or more bestial, or more demonic. So again, Iago says, I am not what I am. The way so in the context of the play, the way I behave does not reflect what I feel inside. Desdemona says, when she's waiting for Othello's ship to come in, she says, I am not merry, but do beguile the thing I am by seeming otherwise. So, and I think that from the soul's perspective, from the ego's perspective first, nature is real. There is a reality to nature. From the soul's perspective, nature is an illusion. And in the East, they call it Maya. So, but here, Shakespeare is connecting nature and ego. They are both not what they seem to be. Again, like I mentioned, Othello puts Desdemona in care of Iago on their way to Cyprus. So just, again, that Iago and Desdemona, there's a connection there. And that ego carries nature to a state of war. It is through ego that the soul experiences opposites, the clash of opposites. Towards the end of the play, Desdemona is asking Iago to talk on her behalf. So she kneels to Iago. So this is nature subduing herself to ego. And it was Iago that Desdemona asked, will describe, a woman of quality, So it is Iago that describes her. So again, this can point to the ego or to the rational mind describing nature. Figuring out nature. What are the qualities of nature? After experiencing Desdemona suffer, Iago becomes more honest. So this might point to that the ego has a positive quality or a negative quality, and whatever qualities we continually involve ourselves in, whatever becomes our habit, that's what we become. So when Emilia questions Iago, did you do all these manipulative things? He says yes, when he could have easily lied about saying, no, I didn't do that. No, I didn't say that. But I think the cause of why he becomes honest is there's an aspect of him that does, and this could be the soul, that he does become honest. That Desdemona's suffering has triggered in him the need to be honest. I'll jump back here. I'm jumping around a little bit. But Iago says about Desdemona, so will I turn her virtue into pitch. And pitch is kind of a grimy black substance. And out of her goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all. ENMESH, enmesh, capture, trap them all. So again, the ego traps the soul. The soul experiences the negative aspect of nature through ego. And it also points, I think Shakespeare saying, is that ego enmeshes all of us. All of us are enmeshed by ego. It is our egos that trap all of us, trap all of our souls. Okay, Othello and Desdemona, how they interact or what they say about one another. So Othello says, and I think this is an indirect allusion to Desdemona. I think he's talking with Emilia. He says, it is the very error of the moon. She comes more near earth than she was wont and makes men mad. So again, the ego, it is the ego and the excesses of the ego, the excessive desires of ego, uh, wanting nature, desiring nature, possessing nature, that makes men mad. In the soul nature, we are harmonious. There is no wanting, desiring, grabbing, possessing of nature. There's more just an appreciation, a love, an interaction, a wholesome interaction with nature. Othello says of Desdemona after he's been manipulated by Iago, she turned to folly and she was a whore. So there are a couple of interpretations, but the one I want to focus on is really that's Othello unconscious of him giving his soul away, his soul consciousness away. So succumbing to the manipulations of ego, soul gives away its inherent nature, its love, its care, its compassion. So it is Othello who has actually hoarded his nature, has given his nature away. Desdemona says about Othello, something has puddled his clear spirit. So here we have the image of water. Water can be an image of the subconscious, and it is in the subconscious where impulses reside, where bestial qualities and desires reside. It is in the subconscious. She also says, and again, this is referring to, she's talking about Othello, men's natures wrangle with inferior things. So if we're talking about Othello's nature, we're talking about the soul nature. Men's natures wrangle with inferior things, though great ones are their object. So she is talking about herself, but nature itself, from the standpoint of soul, is inferior. What the soul desires is a relationship with spirit, not with nature. Again, Othello calls Desdemona, the cunning pattern of excelling nature. Again, cunning. Nature tricks the soul via ego that it is real, that it is the only reality, that there is no other reality. Othello says, or Desdemona says of Othello, I saw Othello's visage in his mind. So what attracted Desdemona to Othello was the qualities of Othello, what existed within Othello, within his mind. So again, this is an image in the positive state. This is prior to Iago's manipulations, the ego's manipulations with soul, that they were in harmony. They were attracted to one another in a pure state. There was no grabbing, possessing, desiring, selfish desiring. Some general statements I want to make about nature and soul. So, towards the beginning of the play, the Duke and the senators of Venice they're trying to figure out whether the Turks, their enemies, whether the Turks are trying to make a play for Rhodes or a play for Cyprus. And the play for Rhodes, one of the senators says, "'Tis a pageant to keep us in false gaze." So this would be a description of nature. That, again, from the soul perspective and through the ego, through the soul's identification with the ego, it thinks nature is the only real thing, when from the spirit or the pure soul perspective, nature is an illusion. It is Maya. Okay, and then just the word soul. So the soul is mentioned by other characters. So I think Amelia, and I'll talk about this a little bit later too. I think Amelia mentioned something about soul to bliss. One of the characters talks about my pure soul. So again, I think Shakespeare peppers the word soul throughout Othello, indicating to give indication to us that he is talking about soul. Okay, so what are some of the positive qualities that can lead one out of ego consciousness to soul consciousness? So I think the main one talked about in Othello, and I'll mention a couple of others, but the biggest quality is patience. So, and we've talked about this before, especially I think with Hamlet. All of the villains in Hamlet are in haste. They're not patient. So if you read Othello, you'll see the word patience a lot, and so patience or impatience. So even the play Tush, I believe it's pronounced Tush, begins Othello, and Tush is an expression of impatience. But you will see the word patience sprinkled frequently throughout Othello. Another quality is contentment. So being content, being happy with what you have. Okay. A hallmark of Iago, in essence, ego is not being content, always wanting something more, always doing something. Humility. So humility also, so again, antithetical to ego. Humility is mentioned throughout the play. So kind of the three major qualities, I'm sure there are more, but patience, contentment, and humility are mentioned a lot in Othello, with patience being, I think, the number one quality. There are quite a few Judeo, primarily Christian, but Judeo and Judeo-Christian allusions in Othello. So I'll start with, so again, Othello, when he comes to Cyprus, it's after his ship goes through the storm, and he arrives in Cyprus and sees Desdemona. He says, "It gives me wonder great as my content to see you here before me. O my soul's joy! If after every tempest come such calms, may the winds blow till they have wakened death, and let the laboring bark climb hills of seas Olympus high, and duck again as low as hell's heaven." And hell's heaven is a contraction, meaning hell is heaven. Hell is to heaven. So the distance between the two. So again, the tempest, it is the soul through the ego experiencing the dualities of nature, pleasure and pain, happiness and sorrow, constantly being shuttled between the two. The laboring bark is an image of the human body and the human mind that climbs hills Olympus high and duck again as low as hell's heaven. So again, this can be what the soul and experiences through the medium of ego all the time. Okay, so the Christian allusion to that. So this is an allusion to when Christ rebuked the winds and the sea when he was in a ship with his disciples. So the scripture says Christ rebuked the winds and the sea, and after was a great calm. So this is a reference to yoga, which I'll talk about later. But again, this is spirit versus nature. One of the next one. So later on, a character talks about the death of Brabantio. This is Desdemona's father. Basically saying his body was shore. They describe his death as shore his old thread in twain. His body died. So he torn in twain. So again, we have the two. And this is an allusion to the veil of the temple was rent in twain. This is referencing Christ's death. The veil of the temple in Jerusalem was rent in twain, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. So the rocks split in two, the veil split in two. The earthquake, the earth opened, creating a division. So again, this is reference to unity, which is Christ, versus duality, nature. At the end, Othello talks about the base Judean. So this is a reference to Judas. So there's another interpretation. I think it says the base Indian. And I don't know if Shakespeare means the base Indian as from India, which would be a good reference because India is the motherland of spirituality. But Harold Goddard mentioned in his wonderful meaning of Shakespeare that he thinks that the base Judean is a better reference because later on, Othello, either talking to himself or talking to Desdemona, I think he's talking to himself, he says, I kissed thee before I betrayed thee. So again, this is another reference to Judas, that Judas kissed Jesus before he betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. So again, this is another image of an impulse or need or gratification for earthly things versus spiritual things. As has been mentioned by many others, Iago's I am not what I am is the opposite of God's I am that I am of Exodus 3:14. So again, all of these illusions, Judeo-Christian illusions, point to the dichotomy of spirit versus nature. Okay, so last topic here, we'll talk about yoga in Othello. So Othello says, peace and be still. So this is a reference to Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. So this is one of the most concise statements about what yoga is. And this also alludes to Christ stilling the tempest. This is all about, through yoga, and there are certain yogic techniques that one would have to practice, but what yoga does is it stills, again, all of the thinking, all of the, it stills the thinking mind, the mind that is constantly going, the feelings and the impulses and desires that are constantly going. Yoga stills all of these. It makes one, it brings one to a state of peace, so a state of not war. Othello, in talking about Desdemona, basically says that she was special that ever did lift I up. So what he's talking about there is nature, right? That was awake, that was a human being. But the spiritual interpretation is the third eye. So that ever did lift I up. So I is singular. He doesn't say eyes, he says I, the singular. So this is in reference to the third eye, the spiritual eye. The eye in the east, referenced in Romeo and Juliet. So to me, again, Shakespeare knew about the locations of soul and the processes of yoga. Again, so the next point, again, Amelia talks about her bringing her soul to bliss. She's willing to die. And again, this, spiritually speaking, again, this is dying to the world and bringing the soul to spirit, which is bliss and love. Okay. Another tool often discussed in yoga is discrimination. So, and again, this is where the ego and the soul are similar, but not quite the same. So the soul discriminates for what is true and what is false. What is nature, what is Maya, what is spirit, what is soul. And Shakespeare uses the sword. The sword has long been a symbol of discrimination. So, and Othello has that famous line, keep up your bright swords, or the dew will rust them. So in the action of the play, he's saying, actually, don't use that. Don't use your swords. No, be at peace. But from a spiritual perspective, what that can mean, keep up your bright sword, or or the dew will rust them. If they're brought low, it'll go down again. Dew being a symbol of water, it will go down into the subconscious, where all your base desires are, where all your negative impulses are. So again, we have a split between spirit and nature. Again, I think it was Montano and someone else, I can't recall who, but again, these were people waiting for Othello's ship to come in. And they have a conversation about they can't discern, they can't separate what is the sky and what is the water. So the negative interpretation of this is they lack the soul discernment, excuse me. They can't discern what is, so sky would be spirit, and the water would be the subconscious or nature. They cannot discern between the two. Othello uses the word encave, E-N-C-A-V-E. So encave can mean, of course, to be brought in, to limit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But encave can also mean interiority. In the East, meditation is often referred to as going into one's cave, going into the darkness in order to eventually see the light. Again, breath is mentioned in Othello. I believe it's Othello who says, "Great Jove, swell his sail with thine own powerful breath." I may be wrong on that. But like I mentioned in Macbeth, breath is always mentioned in the dramas, I believe. So, and again, in yoga, to be able to control one's breath allows you to experience higher states of consciousness. You begin to see the breath is intimately linked with ego. And if the breath is not calm or peaceful, the ego is subject to impulses to negative states of consciousness. I think after Othello has killed Desdemona, he says, "Let it all go." So this can be a statement of non-attachment. So in yoga philosophy, attachment is the selfish involvement with others. So even human love can be rooted in a selfishness. How does it affect me? Or if I lose this person, it's losing something that I want, or that I have become attached to. So let it all go. A state of non-attachment, a state of not being selfish in relation to nature and in relation to others. And the last thing I'll talk about here is discipline. So throughout the plays, we talked about this in Macbeth, and it's also exists in Othello. But limits versus excess. So discipline. Being able to discipline oneself, not to give in to impulse, not to give in to desire over and over and over again until it becomes a habit, until it becomes overwhelming to you, until it destroys you. So, and again, this happens in the ego consciousness. This does not happen in soul consciousness. In soul consciousness, the impulses, the desires, the negative thinking, all of that goes away in soul consciousness. So just to sum it up, Othello can, an interpretation of Othello can be an allegory of the soul. The soul identifies itself with ego, and then through desire and repeated giving into desire repeatedly, and then how that destroys the soul's relationship with nature. So on one level, ego destroys the soul and destroys nature. But in another sense, Othello could never be with Desdemona, because nature, no matter how pure it can be, is still an illusion to the soul. And other Shakespearean critics have pointed out that Othello, in the name Othello, you have the word hell, and in the name of Desdemona, you have demon. And actually, when Othello becomes more and more enraged with Desdemona, he starts calling her Desdemon, not Desdemona. So, but again, from the soul perspective, nature is, again, like Desdemona said, although it is great, it is an inferior thing to spirit. So again, Othello can be seen as an allegory, I believe, as an interaction between soul, ego, and nature. Let me know what you think in the comments below, but we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.